In the summer of 1781, the most powerful army in the world was trapped on a Virginia peninsula and didn't even know it. A British general believed he was safe. He believed the Royal Navy ruled the seas. He believed George Washington was 300 miles away, camped outside New York City, waiting to attack a fortress he could never take. He was wrong about all of it, because George Washington had just pulled off the single greatest deception in American military history. And by the time the British figured it out, it was already too late to save their army, or their war. By 1781, the American Revolution had dragged on for 6 brutal years. 6 years of frozen winters at Valley Forge, 6 years of defeats, retreats, and a Continental army that was underfed, underpaid, and running out of time. The British still held New York City. They still had thousands of troops in the South. And King George III still believed he could crush this rebellion through sheer force. But Washington was about to prove something the British never expected from a backwoods American general: that the mind can win what the sword cannot. What you're about to see is the story of how George Washington deceived not one, but 2 British commanders at the same time, marched an entire army 500 miles without the enemy knowing where he'd gone, and cornered the finest British general in America against the sea itself. This is the story of Yorktown. This is the story of the trick that ended. To understand the trap Washington set, you first have to understand just how desperate things had become. By early 1781, the Continental Army was a shadow of what it needed to be. Soldiers hadn't been paid in months. Some regiments had mutinied. Congress had almost no money left to fund the war. Washington himself wrote that the army was at the end of our tether, one bad season away from total collapse. Meanwhile, the British had shifted their strategy south, believing the Carolinas and Virginia were full of loyalists, just waiting to rise up and crush the rebellion from within. Leading that southern campaign was a general who terrified American commanders more than almost anyone else in the war: Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis was aggressive, ambitious, and dangerous. He'd already battered American forces at Camden and fought Nathanael Greene to a bloody standstill at Guilford Courthouse. He was a real threat, the kind of general who could win a war outright if given the chance. But Cornwallis had a problem. He kept winning battles and losing armies. Every victory cost him men he couldn't replace, thousands of miles from home, in a country that hated him more with every burned farm and looted town. By the summer of 1781, on orders from his superior, General Sir Henry Clinton in New York, Cornwallis marched his army into a small tobacco port on the Virginia coast, a place almost nobody outside Virginia had ever heard of: Yorktown. Cornwallis was ordered to fortify a deep-water port there so the Royal Navy could resupply and evacuate his army if needed. It seemed like a safe, reasonable position. The British owned the seas. As long as the Royal Navy controlled the water, Yorktown was a fortress with an open back door. What Cornwallis didn't know, what almost no one on the British side knew, was that Washington had been quietly working on something for months, something that would slam that back door shut. Washington had spent years, trying to recapture New York City from the British. It was the symbolic heart of the war, the prize he wanted more than any other. For most of 1781, that's exactly what he was planning: a direct assault on New York alongside his French ally. But then, in mid-August 1781, everything changed with a single piece of news. A French fleet under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, nearly 30 warships strong, was sailing from the Caribbean toward the Chesapeake Bay. Not New York, the Chesapeake. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, and Washington knew it instantly. If de Grasse's fleet could control the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and if Washington could get his army to Virginia fast enough, they could trap Cornwallis's entire force against the coast with no way to escape by land or sea. It was a stunning idea. It was also almost impossible. Washington's army was in New York. Cornwallis was in Virginia, over 450 miles away. There was no highway system, no railroad, nothing but dirt roads, rivers, and forests between them. Moving thousands of men, horses, and heavy artillery that far that fast, without the British catching on. It had never been done in this war. Some said it couldn't be done at all. And here's the part that made it even more dangerous. General Clinton, the British commander-in-chief, still had over 10,000 troops sitting comfortably in New York City. If Clinton figured out that Washington was pulling his army away to march south, he could either strike the weakened American position left behind, or send ships south to reinforce Cornwallis before Washington ever arrived. Washington had one shot, and it depended entirely on convincing Clinton that nothing had changed at all. This is where Washington stopped being just a general and became one of the greatest deceivers in military history. He knew he couldn't hide the fact that his army was moving. Too many men, too much equipment, too many local eyes and loose tongues. So instead of trying to hide the movement, Washington did something far smarter. He let the British see exactly what he wanted them to see, and nothing more. Washington ordered his engineers to build large encampments near Chatham, New Jersey, big enough to house a massive invasion force. He had bake ovens constructed, dozens of them, large enough to feed thousands of soldiers. A clear signal to any British scout that an army was settling in for a long siege of New York. He had boats gathered and staged along the New Jersey shoreline, as if preparing for an amphibious assault across the Hudson. He wrote, and deliberately allowed to be intercepted, letters detailing plans for an attack on New York, discussing troop placements and timing in careful, convincing detail. Even his own soldiers, marching south, mostly believed they were headed toward New York. Washington kept the true destination secret from almost everyone. Some accounts suggest even his own officers didn't know the real plan until they were already well on the march. That's how tightly he controlled the information. If his own men didn't fully know where they were going, there was no way British spies could figure it out either. This was psychological warfare in its purest form. Washington understood something that many generals never grasp. You don't have to hide the truth. You just have to give the enemy a more convincing lie. And it worked. General Clinton, sitting in his New York headquarters, received report after report confirming what he already expected, that Washington was preparing to attack the city. He kept his 10,000 troops locked in place, bracing for an assault that was never. Meanwhile, under the cover of this elaborate ruse, roughly 2,000 Continental soldiers and 4,000 French troops under the Comte de Rochambeau began the long march south, through New Jersey, across Pennsylvania, through Delaware, and into Maryland and Virginia. It's hard to overstate how demanding this march was. Soldiers covered nearly 15 to 20 miles a day in the brutal late summer heat. Supplies were thin. Many men marched without proper shoes. And the entire time, they had to maintain absolute discipline, because one slip, one captured courier, one loose-lipped soldier in a tavern could unravel the entire plan. But they held together. Mile after mile, day after day, the largest coordinated Franco-American movement of the entire war crept steadily toward Virginia, and the British had no idea it was happening. While Washington's army marched, the fate of the entire operation was actually being decided somewhere else entirely, out on the open water. On September 5, 1781, Admiral de Grasse's French fleet arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and anchored there, blocking the entrance. Just hours later, a British fleet under Rear Admiral Thomas Graves arrived to challenge them. What followed was the Battle of the Chesapeake, and it might be the single most underrated battle of the entire American Revolution. Most Americans have never even heard of it. But without this naval engagement, Yorktown never happens the way. The two fleets pounded each other for hours. Neither side won a decisive tactical victory in terms of ships sunk, but strategically, it was a total disaster for the British. Admiral Graves hesitated, made cautious maneuvering decisions, and ultimately withdrew to New York for repairs, leaving the Chesapeake Bay entirely in French hands. This was the moment the trap truly closed. With de Grasse controlling the bay, Cornwallis's escape route by sea was gone. The Royal Navy, the most powerful naval force on Earth, had just lost control of the one stretch of water that could have saved an entire British army. Cornwallis was still fortifying Yorktown, still believing reinforcements or evacuation were possible. He had no idea that the door had already been sealed shut behind him. By late September 1781, Washington's combined force, now swelled to nearly 17,000 men, American and French together, arrived outside Yorktown and began surrounding Cornwallis's position on all sides. Picture it. Cornwallis had roughly 8,000 British and German troops crammed into a small fortified town on a narrow peninsula. Behind him, the York River, now controlled by the French Navy. In front of him, nearly double his number of enemy troops, backed by heavy siege artillery. To his flanks, swamps and open ground offering. He was completely surrounded. And the trap had been set so quietly, so convincingly, that Cornwallis hadn't even realized the scale of the danger until it was already closing. 1781, American and French forces began digging their first parallel siege trench, just 800 yards from the British lines. An extraordinary feat of engineering under fire, carried out largely at night to avoid British cannon. Day after siege lines crept closer. American and French artillery pounded the British defenses relentlessly. Yorktown's buildings crumbled, supplies dwindled, and still Cornwallis waited for the one thing that might save him. Word that Clinton was sending a relief fleet from New York. That word never came in time. Now we reach the moment that decided everything. The night of October 14th, 1781. Two British defensive strongpoints, known as redoubts 9 and 10, stood in the way of completing the second American siege line. These were heavily fortified positions, protected by sharpened stakes, ditches, and determined British defenders. They had to fall, and fast. Washington split the assignment between his allies. The French would take Redoubt 9. The Americans would take Redoubt 10. And leading the American assault was a young, fiercely determined officer who wanted to prove something to the world, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton had spent much of the war desperate for battlefield command, frustrated by years serving as Washington's aide. This was his moment. He personally led roughly 400 American light infantry troops in a daring nighttime bayonet charge, with unloaded muskets. Think about that for a second. Washington ordered the attack to happen with bayonets only, no gunfire, specifically to preserve the element of surprise. It was an incredibly risky, almost fearless plan. Success depended entirely on speed, silence, and raw courage. Under cover of darkness, Hamilton's men surged forward, tore through the wooden stakes protecting the redoubt, and overwhelmed the British defenders in brutal, close-quarters combat. In less than 10 minutes, Redoubt 10 had fallen. Minutes later, the French seized Redoubt 9 as well. Both key positions, captured in a single night, at incredible personal risk, through sheer audacity and discipline. With both redoubts in American and French hands, the second siege line was complete. Allied artillery could now be moved dangerously close to the British defenses, and Yorktown was subjected to merciless, continuous bombardment. Cornwallis was out of options. On the night of the 16th of October, he attempted one last desperate gamble, trying to evacuate his army across the York River under cover of darkness to escape northward. But a sudden violent storm scattered his boats and made the crossing impossible. It was as if nature itself had joined the American cause that night. Cornwallis's last chance at escape was washed away by the storm. There was nothing left to do. On October 17, 1781, exactly 4 years to the day after the British surrender at Saratoga, a lone British drummer climbed atop the earthworks at Yorktown and began beating the call for parley. The guns went quiet. After 6 brutal years of war, the sound of that single drum meant something almost unimaginable. The British were asking to. On October 19, 1781, nearly 8,000 British and German soldiers marched out of Yorktown and formally surrendered their arms. It was one of the largest single surrenders in British military history up to that point. Cornwallis, humiliated, claimed illness and refused to attend the ceremony in person, sending his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, in his place. In a final, almost poetic twist, O'Hara first attempted to surrender his sword to the French commander Rochambeau, who politely redirected him to the actual American commander present, General Benjamin Lincoln, whom Washington had chosen to formally accept the surrender. Legend holds that as the British troops marched out, Their military band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside." Whether or not that detail is entirely accurate, it captures the moment perfectly. Because that's exactly what had happened. A ragtag colonial army, dismissed for years by the greatest empire on earth as untrained farmers and amateurs, had just outmarched, outmaneuvered, and outfought the finest military machine in the world. Yorktown didn't officially end the Revolutionary War on paper. That would take almost 2 more years of negotiation, culminating in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. But make no mistake, Yorktown ended the war in every way that mattered. When news of the surrender reached London, British Prime Minister Lord North reportedly responded with words that captured the moment perfectly. "Oh God, it's all over." Political support for continuing the war in Britain collapsed almost overnight. Parliament had had enough. Within months, peace negotiations began in earnest, negotiations that would ultimately recognize the independence of the United States of America. Think about what actually made this victory possible. It wasn't just courage on the battlefield, though there was plenty of that. It was strategic deception, Washington convincing Clinton that nothing had changed, right up until it was far too late to respond. It was flawless coordination between American and French forces separated by language, culture, and thousands of miles. It was daring, disciplined execution, like Hamilton's silent bayonet charge into the night. And it was a fair amount of what many called sheer providence. A storm at exactly the right moment, a fleet arriving at exactly the right. Never one for excessive celebration, wrote with quiet, powerful humility that the events of that campaign seemed almost too perfectly aligned to be anything other than the hand of Providence guiding the American cause. This is one of the greatest stories in American history. It wasn't won by simply outgunning the enemy. It was won by outthinking them. By a general who understood that the most powerful weapon on any battlefield isn't always the cannon. Sometimes, it's the lie the enemy chooses to believe. George didn't just win a battle at Yorktown. He orchestrated one of the most brilliant deceptions in military history, and in doing so, secured the birth of a nation. So the next tells you that the American Revolution was won by luck alone. Remember Yorktown. Remember a commander-in-chief so disciplined, so patient, and so brilliant that he fooled 2 British generals at once, and marched an army 450 miles to spring the trap of a lifetime. Remember Alexander Hamilton, charging into darkness with an empty musket and nothing but courage. Remember the soldiers, American and French, who marched through heat, hunger, and uncertainty because they believed in something bigger than themselves. This is the story of how America won its independence, not just through bravery, but through brilliance. And it's a story that deserves to be remembered by every single American. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we bring you incredible true stories of American courage and military genius every single week. Drop a like on this video if you think George Washington deserves to be remembered as one of the greatest strategic minds in history. Not just a general, but a mastermind. And I want to hear from you. What other American victory should I cover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. I read every single one, and your ideas shape what we cover on this channel. Thank you for watching, and as always, never forget the price that was paid for American freedom.